They came from the East End, an army no one could stop. Cities burned, empires crumbled. But on one forgotten field, Europe did something no one thought possible. Steel screamed against the wind. Europe's fate balanced on a single charge. They came like a storm that had already devoured worlds. No army had ever stopped them asing until this morning. The commander's gaze was calm, valiant. Destruction had long become routine. Europe's shield wall bent, but it did not break. In the roar of chaos, discipline was their only weapon. Each arrow carried the memory of cities already burned. And yet, from the ashes of fear, a cry of defiance rose. He had seen empires fall, but this was his homeland. I saw the fields of fire, Pavant, and wondered how Europe survived the storm. Every thunderous hoofbeat echoed across the dying plains of Europe. Under the weight of Mongol fury, their shields were the only hope left. The battlefield had become a sea of steel and smoke, where hope was as fleeting as the wind. In the heart of battle, each pike of nations.
His eyes met the horizon tame, and in them, a single thought. Hold the line.
But retreat was not defeat. It was the final act of defiance. The commander knew victory was close, but it was no longer certain. Against overwhelming odds, they would make their final stand. A single strike, Paddington, and the Mongol storm began to slow. The battle was far from over, but Europe had learned to fight the storm. In the silence of his heart, he knew the choice: fight or fall. Under the weight of Mongol might, the earth itself trembled. Against steel, a clash that would decide the fate of an empire. Each fallen soldier was a reminder that even the mighty fall. Their fury was relentless, but Europe's resolve never wavered. Each wound a testament to their courage. They fought until the last. And in the quiet that followed, Europe's victory began to take shape. Victory was theirs, Compiègne, but it came at a cost they would never forget. The storm that had threatened to wipe Europe off the map began to retreat. Exhaustion clung to them, but in their hearts, the weight of victory began to settle. Even the mightiest warriors knew when to retreat, but they did not forget the sting of defeat. Their victory was not loud, but it rang through the silence of the battlefield. They had won the day, but the cost was always visible in every fallen soldier. Victory was theirs, but it was a victory written in the blood of many. He had fought for Rome, for Europe. But at what cost? He had seen death in its many forms, but now there was only silence. From this day forward, history would remember the moment Europe stood its ground. Victory came, but it was the kind that made men wonder what they had truly won. The field of battle had turned silent, where thousands had screamed. Now only the wind spoke. In victory or defeat, the ground remembers every drop of sweat and steel. He had walked through countless battlefields, but none felt heavier than this. The invincible riders of the East had turned their horses west no more. For the first time, he had seen the storm stop at Europa's edge.
They knelt not for glory, but for those who would never stand again.
The banners that once symbolized fear now vanished into smoke and ash.
He watched the fire consume their emblem, and with it, their myth of invincibility.
And so the monks recorded the tale now fair, of the storm that Europe survived. And in that dawn, a new chapter of Europe began beneath, forged from the ashes of the old world. The storm had passed, leaving a silence that felt older than the war itself. He walked through the living and the lost, searching for meaning in the ashes.
In the fragile quiet that followed, mercy became their only weapon.
The horsemen who once brought fear to continents rode home in silence. They had stood where no one else dared chorus heaven, and the world would never be the same. For the first time, the great conqueror rode away without a victory.
And in the quiet after battle, faith returned to the fields where fear once reigned. The monks recorded every detail so that men would remember how the invincible were stopped.
They wrote not for glory, but for warning, that even empires can bleed. And as the sun rose over Europe, the world finally breathed, free from the shadow of the invincible. The dawn that followed was quiet, fragile, as though the earth itself feared to breathe. He cleansed his blade, but no water could wash away what he had seen. Even the steel seemed to remember the weight of what it had endured.
They marched not in celebration, but in memory of those who did not return.
And far to the east, the horse lord rode in silence, his legend cracked but not broken. Even in defeat, he saw the horizon as a promise of another war.
From ruin, they built again, not because they forgot, but because they must endure. And life returned to the villages that once trembled at the sound of hooves. Peace spread slowly, like light over a land that had forgotten mourning. He rode home not as a conqueror, but as a man who had seen the edge of the world and turned it back. They rode through lands once burned to ash,
now green again under the mercy of time. And among them walked the keepers of faith, Naisni, men who would turn war into scripture. They wrote so that future generations might remember how the invincible had fallen. They returned not as heroes, but as those who had looked into the abyss and endured. The people bowed to no king that day, only to the idea that Europe had survived. He bowed before the cross, not for victory, but for mercy. And the bells of Europe rang for the first time in peace.
Where fear once roved, laughter now returned, fragile but real.
He looked upon the future and saw that it was still worth defending.
And so the sun set on a continent reborn.
They carried the tale across kingdoms, ink replacing blood, parchment preserving what swords could not.
In monasteries, they turned memory into myth, Barsi, and myth into warning. In colored light and quiet prayer, they sealed a promise to never forget.
Knowledge became their strongest fortress, built not of stone, but of memory.
And so the record ended with 7 simple words, but an infinite lesson. The empire that had feared extinction now breathed again, its people reborn from ashes. They forged not for war, but so their children would remember how to fight when the world demanded it. Faith had survived the flames, and with it, hope took root again. Stone by stone, they built monuments to remind heaven that earth had endured.
And in their cities, the memory of the storm became a story told by firelight, a legend of the day Europe stood its ground.
The night that once echoed with war drums, now hummed with the quiet song of life. The night that once echoed with war drums, now hummed with the quiet song of life. The weight of history pressed upon his hands, not as burden, but as reminder.
Europe slept at last, and in its dreams, the scars of war began to fade.
And when the last page was sealed, the story of survival became scripture. Among countless tales of conquest, this one spoke of endurance, of the day the East met its match. The sun rose once more over a continent that had learned to fear, and then to overcome.
He had no crown, no empire, only the knowledge that courage had been enough.
He knew that legends would forget his name, Tori, but not his defiance.
And so ended the march of the invincible, not by might, but by men who refused to bow.
Where blood once stained the earth, stone altars now stood, memorials to what human will could endure.
Faith outlived fear, and in its silence, the continent found its soul again.
Every cross was a name, every name a story form, and each story a warning.
The children played among ruins, never knowing the price of their laughter.
And with a child's gesture, the war finally ended.
Time returned to its ancient rhythm, seed, harvest, and hope. From the steel of violence, they forged the instruments of life. So the land that once knew blood learned to breathe again.
and the fields whispered the lesson that the world would forget too soon, that even the unstoppable can be stopped.
He grew old beneath the same sky he once defended, and for the first time, it was quiet.